It was a quiet, sunny afternoon in a peaceful neighborhood. The houses were neat, with gardens full of colorful flowers, and children were playing in the streets. The Thompson family, like many others in the area, had a simple, happy life. John and Sarah Thompson, both in their early 30s, were busy in their cozy home, enjoying the calm of a typical day. Their daughter, Emma, was only a year old, but she was already a bundle of joy, always smiling and exploring her world with a sense of wonder. In the Thompson household, there was a special member of the family who played an important role. Max, their golden retriever, had been with them since before Emma was born. He was loyal, protective, and loved by everyone. Max had a gentle nature and was especially kind to little Emma. He would follow her around the house, wagging his tail, always ready to play. Emma, in return, adored Max. She loved to pull at his fur and giggle as he licked her face, and Max never seemed to mind. He would always be gentle with her, his eyes full of patience. That day, like most others, Max and Emma spent the afternoon together in the living room. Max lay on the floor near Emma, keeping a watchful eye on her as she played with her toys. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming a tune as she prepared dinner, while John sat at the dining table, working on some paperwork. The house was warm and peaceful, and life seemed perfect. The family often took for granted these quiet moments, unaware that the world outside was about to change in an instant. Then, without any warning, everything shifted. The ground beneath the house began to shake violently. The walls rattled, and the furniture moved as if it was alive. Sarah screamed as she tried to keep her balance, her heart racing with fear. John rushed to Emma, trying to protect her as the world around them seemed to crumble. The house groaned and cracked, and windows shattered into 1,000 pieces. Max jumped to his feet, barking loudly as if he knew something terrible was happening. The noise was deafening, the sound of the earth shaking and the house collapsing around them. Max's barks grew louder, almost frantic, as he rushed to Sarah and Emma, nudging them with his head, trying to get their attention. The floor beneath their feet seemed to sway, and Sarah, holding onto Emma tightly, screamed for help, but there was no one to hear. In the chaos of the moment, it was impossible to tell where the danger was coming from. The shaking continued, and the house seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. As the tremors finally slowed down and the noise began to fade, the Thompson family was left in stunned silence. Dust filled the air, and the house, once their safe haven, now seemed like a shattered shell. John, shaken and covered in debris, looked around, realizing that everything had changed. But amidst all the destruction, he knew one thing for sure: he had to protect his family, no matter what. Max, ever faithful, was still by their side, his eyes wide with worry. He didn't leave their side, even for a second, as the family tried to recover from the shock. But as they looked around, they realized that the real challenge was just beginning. Emma's cry pierced the silence, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. They had to find her. As the earth finally stopped shaking, a heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of dust settling on the floor. The once calm and quiet neighborhood had turned into a place of chaos and fear. The house, which had seemed like a safe haven just moments ago, was now a wreck. Sarah and John were both shaken, their hearts still pounding in their chests. It was hard to grasp what had just happened, but the reality quickly set in. The earthquake had hit without any warning, and now everything was different. John, still holding Emma tightly, looked around the room, trying to make sense of the destruction. The walls had cracked, and several pieces of furniture had toppled over. Broken glass littered the floor, and the once neatly arranged items were now scattered across the room. The windows were shattered, leaving the house exposed to the outside world. It was hard to tell how much damage had been done to the rest of the house, but John knew that they needed to act fast. His mind raced. What if there was more danger? What if the aftershocks were coming? Sarah, her face pale and filled with fear, gently placed her hand on Emma's tiny head, trying to comfort her. The baby, still frightened but unharmed, clung to her mother, her little fingers wrapping tightly around Sarah's hand. Max, their loyal dog, stood nearby, his fur covered in dust, but his eyes were wide with concern. He had never seen anything like this before, but he instinctively knew that something was wrong. His ears were perked, and his tail was still as stiff as a board. Max was on high alert, watching over his family as if guarding them from the unknown. John gently set Emma down on the couch, still keeping a close eye on her, and began to assess the damage. The living room was in shambles, but it was nothing compared to what might be outside. He quickly made his way to the front door, trying to push aside debris, but it was no use. The door was jammed shut. The realization hit him like a cold wave. There was no way to leave the house without getting through the wreckage. "Sarah," John called, his voice full of urgency. "We need to find a way out. It's not safe here anymore." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She wanted to scream for help, but she knew they were on their own for now. The earthquake had caused so much damage, and it was clear that the rest of the neighborhood would be in just as bad, if not worse, shape. They needed to move quickly and stay calm. But as she looked at Emma, her heart twisted with worry. The baby was safe for now, but for how long? Max continued to bark anxiously, pacing around the room, his instincts telling him that there was still danger nearby. His eyes scanned every corner of the room, as if searching for a threat. Sarah's gaze fell on him, and for a brief moment, she felt a sense of calm. Max was more than just a dog to them. He was family, and he would protect them with his life if he had to. "Max," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Help us." And that's when she heard it, the faintest cry from the back of the house. It was soft, but unmistakable. The sound of a baby's cry. Emma. No, it couldn't be. Emma was right here with her, but the cry was there, and it sent a chill through Sarah's spine. Something was terribly wrong. Max's head snapped toward the sound, his ears standing upright, and in that moment he was gone. He darted off toward the back of the house, running through the rubble with a speed and purpose that was astonishing. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed John's arm, and together they followed Max, their hearts racing in their chests. Their baby's cry was growing louder now, and the fear that gripped them tightened like a vice. They had to find her, quickly. Max's paws slapped against the debris as he ran through the house, barking urgently, his tail straight, and his eyes wide with panic. His senses were on high alert. He could smell the dust and destruction, but more than anything, he could hear the faint, heartbreaking sound of Emma's cries coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. Every step he took, he grew more determined to find her. Sarah and John, still shaken by the earthquake, hurried to follow Max, their hearts pounding with fear. They tried to clear away fallen bookshelves and broken furniture as they moved, but it felt like time was running out. They couldn't waste a single moment. They needed to find their daughter. "Max, where are you going?" Sarah called, her voice trembling as she stumbled over the mess in her path. Max didn't respond to her call. His focus was entirely on the noise he had heard, the baby's cries that seemed to grow louder with every step. He knew exactly where to go. He had always been the family's protector, and now he was leading them to Emma, like a guardian on a mission. John's eyes scanned the wreckage as they followed Max, a mixture of relief and fear flooding his chest. They were close now. They had to be. The closer they got, the more they could hear Emma's cry. But as they rounded the corner of the hallway and entered the back room, their hearts sank. There, beneath a fallen beam, was their baby girl, Emma. The pile of debris had crashed down, trapping her tiny body underneath. She was lying on her side, her face flushed, tears running down her cheeks as she continued to cry out. Her little hands were reaching for something, anything, to help her out of the nightmare she found herself in. "Emma!" Sarah screamed, her voice a mixture of horror and relief. She rushed forward, but the sight of the beam covering her daughter made it hard to move. Panic rose in her chest. How could she get to her baby? The beam was too heavy for her to lift, and every second that passed seemed like an eternity. John stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what he was seeing. His daughter was trapped, and there was no time to waste. He quickly shoved aside broken furniture and debris, trying to clear the path between him and Emma. His mind was racing. He needed to move quickly, but he had to stay calm. "Sarah, help me," John shouted, his voice tight with urgency. Together, they worked as fast as they could, but the beam was heavy, and it was difficult to get enough leverage to move it. Max, still barking anxiously, ran around them, his eyes fixed on Emma. He refused to leave her side. It was as if he knew what they needed to do, and he wasn't about to stop until they did. "Max," Sarah shouted, desperate. The dog seemed to understand her plea. He rushed toward the debris and began digging around the fallen beam, his paws moving quickly, trying to help in the only way he knew how. Sarah watched, amazed by his loyalty and instinct. Max wasn't just a pet. He was part of the family, and now he was saving their daughter. With every move, the beam shifted slightly, but it wasn't enough. They needed more strength. John gritted his teeth, pushing himself harder. Together, they finally managed to get a good grip on the beam, and with a forceful push, they moved it just enough to free Emma's little body. Max was the first to reach her, his nose gently nudging her, as if trying to comfort her. He whined softly, licking her hand in an effort to reassure her. Emma's cries had slowed, but she was still scared. She was alive. That was all that mattered now. Sarah scooped Emma into her arms, holding her tightly against her chest, feeling the warmth of her baby. Her relief was overwhelming, and she whispered soft words to Emma, trying to calm her. John dropped to his knees beside them, his hands shaking as he stroked Emma's hair. "Thank God," he muttered, closing his eyes in gratitude. Max sat beside them, his tail wagging weakly. He had done it. He had found Emma. And the family was together again, safe for the moment, though the nightmare wasn't over. But for now, they were alive, and that was enough. Max had saved them all. Max sat next to the Thompson family, his fur coated in dust, his ears still alert, but his tail wagging softly now. He had done what he was meant to do. He had found Emma and kept her safe. The family, still shaken from the earthquake, clung to each other, the moments of panic slowly giving way to the overwhelming relief of knowing that Emma was alive. But as the dust settled around them, a heavy silence hung in the air. The house was a shell of what it had been. The walls, once sturdy, now stood cracked and crumbling. Furniture had been tossed around like paper, and glass from broken windows glittered in the wreckage. It was hard to tell what had been lost, but it didn't matter much now. Their first priority was getting out of the house and finding help. John gently kissed Emma's forehead, his hands trembling slightly as he held her close. "We need to get you out of here, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, her face pale, and held Emma even tighter, feeling the small body in her arms as a reminder of just how fragile life was. The weight of the situation hung heavily on them both. But as they started to gather their bearings, Sarah noticed Max again. He was watching them closely, his brown eyes soft but filled with a steady resolve. Despite all the destruction, Max was still there, loyal, unwavering, and full of courage. Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude for the dog that had saved their daughter. She reached down and scratched behind his ears, her fingers shaking. Max nuzzled her gently, as if to say he understood. "We have to figure out how to get out of here," John said, standing up. His face was lined with concern as he scanned the room. He knew that getting outside wasn't going to be easy. The house had been severely damaged, and the front door was blocked by debris. They needed a way out. Fast. Max, still standing by their side, suddenly moved toward the hallway. His nose twitched, and he sniffed the air, his ears perked up. Sarah and John exchanged a glance. Was he leading them somewhere? Without thinking, They both stood up and followed Max down the hall. The hallway, too, was a mess. Broken pieces of the ceiling had fallen, and the floor was covered with shards of wood and plaster. But Max seemed determined. He didn't hesitate or falter. His steps were sure, his head held high as he trotted confidently toward the back of the house. John and Sarah followed, barely able to keep up with the dog's speed. When they reached the back door, Sarah let out a breath of relief. The door had been forced open by the shaking of the house, and they could see a narrow opening just large enough to squeeze through. It wasn't much, but it was their way out. Max, however, wasn't finished yet. He barked once, looking back at them as if urging them to hurry. Sarah quickly crawled through the gap, helping Emma along with her. John followed closely behind, his heart pounding in his chest. They had to move quickly. The outside world was waiting for them, and they needed help. The moment they stepped outside, the full scale of the damage hit them. The neighborhood, once full of life, was now a scene of devastation. Trees had fallen, cars were flipped over, and several homes were completely destroyed. The streets were eerily silent, with only a few scattered sounds of distant sirens and the faint cries of other survivors. Sarah and John looked around, feeling lost and helpless. They had no idea where to go or where to find help. The earthquake had thrown everything into chaos, and the world outside seemed like a completely different place now. But Max, as always, was there. The dog seemed to know what they needed. He trotted ahead, sniffing the air, his ears alert. Sarah and John followed, feeling a sense of trust in their hearts. Max had led them to safety before, and now they hoped he would help them again. They didn't know where to go, but with Max leading the way, they knew they weren't alone. Max led the way through the wreckage, his steps steady despite the chaos around him. The dog's sharp instincts had already proven invaluable, and now Sarah and John followed him through the broken streets, desperate to find help. Emma, still safely cradled in Sarah's arms, was surprisingly calm, her soft breaths tickling her mother's chest as she drifted in and out of sleep. The tremors of the earthquake had scared her, but the warmth and comfort of her mother's embrace helped soothe her. John walked closely behind, his eyes constantly scanning the neighborhood. Every house, every building seemed to have been affected by the quake. Some were completely destroyed, while others had deep cracks that ran from floor to ceiling. The roads, too, were cracked and uneven, making it difficult to walk. Everywhere they looked, there was evidence of the disaster that had shaken their world. The once familiar, peaceful surroundings now felt unrecognizable. Max, however, showed no sign of slowing down. His nose was constantly twitching, his ears alert, as if searching for something or someone. The dog's focus never wavered as he made his way through the streets, moving with purpose and determination. It was as though he knew exactly where they needed to go, and he wasn't about to stop until they got there. "Where are we going, Max?" John muttered, glancing around as he kept pace with the dog. It was a strange feeling, relying on an animal to lead them in such a situation, but they had no other choice. Max had already proven his loyalty and resourcefulness. In this moment, he was their guide. As they moved further from their house, the destruction became even more apparent. Piles of debris covered the streets, and broken windows lined the blocks like shattered glass in a mirror. The quiet was unsettling. No distant laughter, no sounds of neighbors calling out to each other. The earthquake had wiped out any normalcy, leaving behind only the debris of what used to be. After what felt like hours of walking through the wreckage, Max suddenly stopped. He stood in front of a partially collapsed building, his head tilted slightly, his eyes focused on the entrance, as if he were trying to assess the situation. Sarah and John exchanged a quick glance, uncertain whether it was safe to approach. But they knew they had no other choice. The building looked like it might have been a small community center or a clinic, but now it was a pile of debris, with only a narrow gap between two walls leading inside. Max barked once, his tail still stiff and alert, before trotting toward the gap. It was clear he had found something, or someone. Inside, Sarah hesitated for a moment but followed Max anyway. She knew that they needed help and that this was their best chance to find it. "Let's go," John said quietly, his voice tinged with both fear and hope. Together, they squeezed through the narrow opening, their clothes catching on the jagged edges of debris. Inside, the space was dark and quiet. The faint smell of dust and rubble filled the air. It was a stark contrast to the bustling, bright community center it must have once been. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw movement. A figure was huddled near a pile of bricks, a woman with dark hair and dust-covered clothes. She looked up, startled at first, but then her face softened with recognition. She was alive, just like them. The woman seemed to be in her late 30s, with a look of exhaustion in her eyes. She had been trapped in the building, but it seemed she had managed to survive the worst of the destruction. I thought I was the only one," the woman said, her voice shaky. "When the earthquake hit, I didn't know where to go." Max, ever loyal, approached the woman cautiously, sniffing at her outstretched hand. After a moment, he wagged his tail and nuzzled her, as if to reassure her. The woman smiled weakly, her eyes filling with gratitude. "We're lucky to be alive," Sarah said softly, looking at the woman. "We're looking for help. Do you know where the nearest rescue teams are?" The woman shook her head slowly. "I haven't seen anyone yet. I've been trapped here for hours. I'm not sure where the teams are, but they've got to be out there. We just need to keep going." John, who had been keeping an eye on their surroundings, nodded. "We'll have to find them ourselves then, but at least we're not alone anymore." The three of them, along with Max, gathered their strength and prepared to continue their journey. The woman, although exhausted, seemed determined to move forward. Together, they made their way out of the building and into the wrecked streets once again, their eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of rescue. Max, ever the protector, stayed close to the group, his ears twitching at every sound. The dog seemed to know that they were on the right path now. They weren't alone anymore, and they had a better chance of finding help. The world out, the group moved cautiously through the streets, with Max leading the way as always. The dog's nose twitched at every new scent, his keen ears flicking at every sound, making him an invaluable guide through the devastation. The air was thick with dust, and the once familiar neighborhood felt like a completely different world. Buildings that had been homes and businesses now stood as shattered reminders of the power of the earthquake. The roads were cracked and uneven, and the distant sound of sirens filled the air, though it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. Sarah, still holding Emma tightly, felt the weight of her daughter in her arms, but she was grateful for her calm presence. Emma was quiet now, her little face resting against her mother's chest, perhaps worn out from the shock of the earthquake. Sarah couldn't stop glancing at her, checking to make sure her daughter was okay. After everything that had happened, she could barely believe that Emma had made it out of the rubble. Every moment since they'd found her felt like a miracle. John, walking beside Sarah, kept his gaze fixed ahead. His mind raced with worry. He couldn't shake the thought that they still hadn't found help. They had moved through what felt like endless blocks of devastation, but there was no sign of any rescue teams yet. The whole world seemed to be turned upside down. Every once in a while, he'd catch a glimpse of someone moving in the distance, but when they called out, the figure would disappear into the wreckage, leaving the street eerily quiet once again. Max suddenly stopped in his tracks, his tail stiff, and his ears perked. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Sarah and John exchanged a quick glance. What was it now? Had Max sensed something? Without a word, they followed the dog, moving cautiously toward whatever he had noticed. As they drew closer, they spotted a small group of people gathered in the open. It was hard to tell at first if they were survivors or rescue workers. Their faces were covered in dirt, and their clothes were torn and stained, but they were alive. One of them, a man in his 40s, turned toward them, his eyes wide with surprise when he saw the family approach. He waved them over. "We've been looking for survivors," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Are you okay? Is anyone else with you?" John let out a sigh of relief, his heart finally slowing as he stepped forward. "Yes, we're fine. We've been looking for help too." Sarah gently rocked Emma in her arms, her eyes never leaving the small group. The man who had called them over stepped forward, his expression kind but filled with concern. He quickly assessed the situation. "I'm James," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "We've set up a small shelter just a few blocks from here. We're helping anyone we can find. There are a few medical teams there, and we're organizing transport for those who need it." At the mention of help, Sarah's heart soared. It had felt like they were walking through the destruction endlessly without a sign of anyone who could assist them. The idea of reaching a shelter, of finally finding others who could help, brought a wave of relief that Sarah could hardly put into words. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "We really need to get there. We've been trying to find help all day." James nodded and looked over at Max, who was still standing guard, watching them with his tail wagging. "You have a loyal friend there," he said with a smile. "He's the one who led you here, isn't he?" Sarah smiled softly, her eyes watering. "Yes, Max is the real hero. He found Emma when she was trapped. He's kept us safe all through this." James's face softened, clearly moved by the dog's bravery. "Well, we got some supplies and a place to rest. You can come with us." With that, the small group of survivors, along with Max, Sarah, John, and Emma, began to make their way toward the shelter. The journey was slow, as they had to carefully navigate around fallen buildings and scattered debris. But there was hope now. There was a place where they could find help, and that was all that mattered. As they walked, the air seemed to feel a little lighter, the weight of the tragedy slowly lifting off their shoulders. Max trotted ahead, his pace steady as always, as if he knew that they were almost there. The shelter, only a short distance away, felt like a beacon of safety in the midst of the destruction. They still had a long way to go, but now, for the first time since the earthquake, they felt like they had a chance. Max had led them through the worst, and now he was leading them toward hope. The group continued to walk through the ruined streets, with Max still leading the way, his tail swishing back and forth. The path to the shelter wasn't long, but it felt like it took hours as they carefully maneuvered around the wreckage. The broken buildings loomed over them, a stark reminder of the devastation that had swept through the area. Despite the damage, the air felt different now. There was a sense of purpose, a sense that they were heading toward something safer. The feeling of uncertainty that had gripped them for so long was finally beginning to ease. Sarah kept her arms tightly around Emma, still shaken from everything that had happened. The baby was quiet now, resting her head against her mother's chest, but Sarah could feel the warmth of her tiny body and knew she was still affected by the shock. Every now and then, Emma would stir, but Sarah would whisper softly to reassure her that everything was going to be okay. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Her daughter was alive, and they were going to get through this. John walked beside Sarah, his face etched with concern but also relief. The fear that had been so consuming when the earthquake first struck was still there, but it was now mingled with a sense of hope. The small group of survivors they had met earlier seemed capable and determined, and their presence gave them the strength to keep moving forward. James, the man who had helped them, walked ahead, keeping a lookout for any potential dangers. His eyes were constantly scanning the streets, and he gestured for everyone to stay close. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that was clear in his face. "Just a little farther. Stay close, and keep your eyes open." The small shelter they were headed to wasn't much. A few tarps had been set up to provide some protection from the elements, and a couple of volunteers had set up medical supplies and food. But to Sarah, it felt like a lifeline. After hours of wandering through the devastation, the thought of finally reaching a place where they could rest, where they could get help, was a comfort she hadn't dared to believe in until now. Max led them to the entrance of the shelter, where two more survivors were waiting. One of them, a woman in her 20s, looked up and smiled when she saw them approach. Her face was tired but kind, and she immediately stepped forward to help. "You made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Thank goodness. We've been trying to help everyone we can, but it's been tough. Come inside. Get some rest." Sarah, John, and Emma followed the woman into the shelter, with Max right behind them. Inside, it was relatively quiet. A few other people sat on the ground, tending to small injuries or comforting each other. The air was filled with the smell of food cooking over a small fire, and there were blankets laid out for people to rest. The simple comforts felt like a luxury after everything they had been through. The shelter wasn't perfect, but it was safe. Sarah sat down on one of the blankets, gently placing Emma on her lap. The baby's eyes fluttered as she looked around, sensing the change in atmosphere. "You're okay, Emma," Sarah whispered, stroking her hair. "We're safe now." Max, never one to rest for long, padded around the shelter, sniffing the air and checking on the other survivors. He seemed to be surveying the area, making sure that everyone was accounted for. When he was satisfied, he lay down near the family, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes still alert. It was as if he knew that his job wasn't done yet. John sat beside Sarah, taking a deep breath and letting his shoulders relax for the first time in what felt like hours. He looked around the shelter and saw others who were similarly exhausted, their faces lined with worry, but also a sense of relief. They were all survivors, each with their own story of how they had made it through the disaster. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We're going to make it," John said softly, looking at Sarah. His voice held a strength that he hadn't realized was there until now. "We've survived the worst of it. We'll get through this together." Sarah smiled at him, the weight of the past few hours still heavy on her heart, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. "Together," she echoed, feeling the truth of the words in her soul. Max lifted his head and let out a soft bark, as if to agree. The family looked at him, grateful for the dog's unwavering loyalty and courage. He had saved them, and now he was resting beside them, keeping watch over the family he loved. With Max by their side, Sarah and John knew that no matter how much more they had to face, they would never be alone again. The shelter was quieter now, with the soft hum of conversations and the gentle crackle of the fire in the corner. People were starting to settle in, finding small moments of peace after the chaos of the earthquake. The warmth from the fire was a comfort, and the smell of cooking food filled the air, offering a sense of normalcy that had been so desperately missing. Though the world outside was still a mess of destruction, inside the shelter, people were slowly coming together, forming small pockets of hope in a time of uncertainty. Sarah held Emma close, gently rocking her as the baby drifted into a peaceful sleep. The little girl had been through so much, but now, with the sounds of other survivors talking softly around them, Sarah could almost pretend for a moment that everything was going to be okay. The fear and panic from earlier in the day had settled, replaced with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were safe. They had made it through the worst of it, and they were together. That was all that mattered. John sat beside her, his eyes taking in the sight of the shelter, this small haven that had become their refuge. He had always been a man of action, thinking through every scenario. But even now, sitting in the shelter, he realized that there was nothing he could have done without the strength of his family. And Max. The dog had led them here, kept them safe, and now Max was curled up beside them, his eyes half closed but still alert. The bond between Max and the family was undeniable. He had been their protector, their guide through the darkest hours. And now, as they sat together, there was an unspoken promise of loyalty in the air. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving together. "I don't know what we would have done without Max," Sarah murmured, her voice soft as she glanced down at the dog. Max, sensing her gaze, raised his head slightly, giving a small wag of his tail. His eyes were full of quiet wisdom, as though he knew exactly how much he had done for them. John nodded, his expression full of gratitude. "He's our hero. He saved Emma. He led us to safety." Max didn't respond, of course, but the way he lay there, his body relaxed, but his ears still perked, spoke volumes. He had given everything for them, and in return, he had found his rest, watching over his family like a true protector. As the evening wore on, more survivors gathered in the shelter, and the atmosphere shifted. People began to share stories of what had happened to them, of how they had survived the quake, and how they had managed to escape the devastation. It was a reminder of just how many lives had been affected by the disaster. Sarah listened, her heart aching for each story, but also filled with gratitude. She knew that she and John had been lucky. They had each other. They had Max. Not everyone had that. The night grew darker, and the shelter became more crowded. There were a few small children, some elderly people, and even a few who were still in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. But despite the sadness in the air, there was also a sense of unity. They were all survivors, together in their struggle. They would help each other. They would rebuild. "I'm glad we found this place," Sarah said softly, looking around at the others who were now gathered in the shelter. She didn't need to say much more. They all understood. The sense of safety and the warmth from the fire filled the room, but more than that, it was the feeling of togetherness that mattered most. In the face of destruction, they had come together to support each other, to make sure no one was alone. John smiled, his hand resting on Emma's tiny back as she slept peacefully. "We're going to get through this, Sarah, one step at a time." Max, as if understanding the conversation, stood up and stretched, his body rippling as he moved. He walked over to the small group of survivors sitting around the fire and sat down beside them, as if he were offering his comfort to anyone who needed it. His presence was a balm to everyone there, a reminder of hope in the darkest of times. As Sarah watched him, she knew that no matter what lay ahead, they would be okay. They had survived the worst of it, and with Max by their side, they could face anything. Together, they would rebuild, and together, they would find a new sense of peace, one step at a time. The road ahead would be long, but they had each other. And that, more than anything, was what made all the difference.